Okay, so today we're diving into this special election down in Florida, the Sunshine State, Florida's 6th Congressional District.
Yeah.
And you shared some really interesting articles with us from Politico, The Hill, Forbes, and New York Times. And I think our mission here today is to kind of go beyond the surface level headlines, know?
Definitely.
Really dissect what's going on with the candidates and why is this race so competitive, and what are the big players saying and not saying, right?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. At first glance, you look at this district and you think, oh, this should be, pretty straightforward. President Trump won this district by a huge margin in the last election, 30 points.
Yeah.
But now we're seeing headlines talking about how tight the race is, and it's getting a ton of national attention. So what's going on there?
Right.
What does this tell us about the bigger picture of American politics as we head into, the rest of 2025?
Yeah, so let's meet the players here, right? The candidates, on the Republican side, we have State Senator Randy Fine.
Okay.
And, all the articles really point to his alignment with Trump.
Mm-hmm.
The New York Times even calls him, someone who carries the Trump banner.
Right.
And Trump himself has even endorsed him,
right,
calling him a highly successful Harvard-educated businessman.
Of course.
But there's an interesting wrinkle here, right?
Oh, yeah.
There's a little bit of history with Governor DeSantis. I think we need to unpack a little.
I think that's a great place to start. A lot of the articles that you shared with me, Politico, The Hill,
right,
mentioned that Fine actually initially endorsed DeSantis,
right,
in the presidential primary before switching to Trump.
Right.
And it's interesting because DeSantis himself has kind of hinted at the fact that this race is closer than expected.
Yeah.
And has said, it might be due to a candidate-specific issue.
Right, right.
So you have to wonder, is that, kind of a little jab at Fine?
Yeah, is that a veiled?
Yeah, a little
dig?
A little dig.
Yeah.
At him, So that internal Republican friction could definitely be, playing a role in how voters are thinking about these two candidates.
Interesting. Okay, so on the Democratic side, we have Josh Weil.
Okay.
And he's an Orlando school teacher.
Okay.
And one thing that really stood out to me reading both Forbes and the New York Times is the fundraising difference here.
Oh, yeah.
Weil has raised a lot more money than Fine.
Wow.
I think by mid-March, he was over $9 million compared to Fine's under $1 million.
That's significant.
That's a huge difference, right?
Especially in a district that leans so heavily, towards one party.
Right.
It's something to keep an eye on for sure.
Absolutely. So the articles describe Weil as, a progressive teacher.
Mm-hmm.
And he's really focusing on things like affordability.
Right.
The cost of living day to day for people.
Right.
Concerns about Social Security.
Mm-hmm.
And he's also campaigning against these government funding cuts that people are worried about, especially those tied to Elon Musk.
Yeah. And he's got Bernie Sanders' endorsement,
right,
which signals his progressive stance pretty clearly.
Right.
And the New York Times lays out his core platform,
right,
which is really centered on, expanding healthcare,
right,
and improving access to education.
Right, so let's take a step back for a second because this is what's really interesting to me, right?
Okay.
Trump won this district by a huge margin.
Yeah.
Back in November. And the New York Times even pointed out there's almost twice as many registered Republicans as Democrats in this district.
Right.
So the fact that this is even considered a close race is pretty fascinating.
Yeah, it is interesting.
The Hill even mentioned a Republican internal poll that showed Weil with a 3-point lead.
Wow.
And Forbes had another poll that had Fine ahead by only 4 points. So this is making Republicans a little nervous, I think.
Yeah, I can see why.
As Politico reported.
It's like this clash between how the district looks on paper, all registered voters,
right,
the past results, and then what these recent polls are showing.
Yes.
And Democrats are really jumping on this.
Yeah.
They're using this to say, look, even in Trump country, there's this dissatisfaction brewing within the Republican base.
Right.
Maybe voters aren't buying what Republicans are selling right now.
Yeah, it's a powerful message, and they're really trying to make sure people hear it.
Yeah, they are.
So the DNC is really paying attention to this. Politico talked about how DNC chair Ken Martin actually went down to Florida.
Right.
And he's really emphasizing the importance of Florida and the South in general.
Mm-hmm.
Because the population's growing so much.
Right.
And he's very clearly tying this race to Trump and Elon Musk and trying to really focus on those figures and what they represent to voters.
Yeah, and Politico highlights how Martin is really honing in on these specific voter concerns.
Right.
He's talking about the rising costs that are impacting everyday people in Florida.
Right.
The possibility of tariffs increasing if Trump gets elected.
Right.
And really importantly, anxieties about potential cuts to Social Security.
Right.
Especially among older voters.
Even though Trump has said he won't cut it.
Exactly. And it's, not a new strategy to link the local candidate to national figures.
Right.
And their maybe less popular policies.
Right.
But it's interesting that the DNC chair himself is spending time and resources on a district like this.
Yeah, it seems like a real shift in strategy for them.
Yeah, exactly. And according to Politico, Martin calls this a 50-state strategy.
Right.
So they want to be competitive everywhere.
Everywhere, not just the swing states that always get all the attention.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he admits that Democrats have a disadvantage in Florida with voter registration.
Right.
But he's saying, they can still find a way to win.
Right.
By focusing on unregistered voters and getting their base really energized.
Right.
And the fact that the DNC is putting, 6 figures into this race shows that they're serious about this new approach.
So Republicans are definitely not ignoring this challenge.
Definitely not.
The Hill reported that Trump did not 1 but 2 teletown halls.
Wow.
For Randy Fine.
Okay.
And really urged his supporters to vote for him.
Right.
And both The Hill and Forbes said that Elon Musk's Political Action Committee, America PAC, is spending money in this race, too.
So both sides are really bringing in the big guns here.
Yeah, so, it seems like the Republicans really don't want to lose this one, right?
Definitely not. The Hill even used the word humiliation.
Right.
To describe what a loss in this district would be for them.
Right.
And they're pulling out all the stops to make sure that doesn't happen.
Right. And it's interesting, the Hill connected the decision to pull Repoli Stefanik's nomination for UN ambassador back to this race. Because Trump himself said he didn't even want to take a chance of having a close race for her seat.
Right.
So it really shows how important holding on to that House majority is for them.
It's really crucial for them, especially with such a narrow majority.
Yeah.
Losing even one seat, especially in a special election like this, where they were expected to win pretty easily, would make it even harder for Speaker Johnson to get anything done.
Right.
And Ford O'Connell, Republican strategist, who's quoted in The Hill, said that the priority right now is to have reinforcements in the House to back up President Trump's agenda if he gets reelected.
Okay, so how are Republicans explaining the fact that this race is so close?
Well, we already talked about DeSantis's comment about a candidate-specific issue.
Right.
And it seems like a lot of Republican strategists think the same thing. The Hill mentioned that Fine didn't start running TV ads until pretty late.
Oh, okay.
So Weil had a big advantage just because he was on the air first.
Just from being on TV more.
Exactly.
Gotcha.
And now that Fine is running ads and getting help from outside spending groups like America PAC, they think he should be able to catch up and win pretty comfortably.
So what about early voting numbers? Are they saying anything?
Yeah, so The Hill cited some data from Decision Desk HQ.
Okay.
And it looks like in the days leading up to the election, the trend was moving in Fine's favor.
Okay.
And they're predicting that Republicans will have an advantage by Election Day.
Okay.
But the analyst also said that Democrats have actually overcome pretty big Republican registration advantages in recent special elections.
Right.
So it's still really up in the air.
So anything can happen.
Exactly. And that's a good point, because the numbers might favor Republicans.
Right.
But we've seen that a really motivated Democratic base and a good campaign on the ground can totally change the game.
Right.
The Hill even brought up the example of a Democrat winning a state Senate seat in Pennsylvania that Trump won by a lot.
Right.
So that's probably why Democrats are so optimistic and Republicans are so nervous.
Makes sense. So the Democrats are really using this close race to say that the Republican Party is in trouble even in places where they usually do well.
Right.
The New York Times quoted House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries saying, the American people are not buying what the Republicans are selling.
It's a pretty strong statement.
Yeah. So what about Weil's campaign specifically? What are they doing?
So the New York Times goes into this.
Right.
And it seems like they're really positioning Weil as someone who will focus on the needs of this specific district.
Okay.
It's the 6th district.
Right.
And they're trying to paint Fine as, just a typical Republican.
Yeah, just a party guy.
Yeah, party clone who's just going to follow the national party line.
Right.
So they're emphasizing those local issues and making Weil seem like an independent voice.
Right.
And they're hoping that will appeal to voters who are maybe a little fed up with how things are going.
Right. Regardless of party.
Exactly.
And we talked about how much money Weil has raised. Forbes suggested that this isn't just about having more money to spend. It actually shows how enthusiastic Democratic donors are about this race.
Yeah.
And how much they want to flip this seat.
And it lets the Weil campaign really do a lot more. You know,
Yeah.
they can reach more voters. They could be on TV more.
Right.
And they can maybe even overcome that Republican advantage in voter registration.
So it shows that money really does matter.
Yeah, even in a district that leans one way,
Yeah.
a well-funded campaign can really shake things up.
Okay, so let's zoom out a little bit.
Okay.
And look at the bigger picture here.
Mm-hmm.
Forbes talked about how these two special elections in Florida,
Right.
this one in the 6th district
Mm-hmm.
and the one in the 1st district,
Right.
are really early tests of how strong Trump's agenda is.
As he heads into, a potential second term.
Right, exactly.
And the result of this race in the 6th district, and especially the margin of victory,
Right.
is going to be seen as a sign of how voters are feeling about Trump
Right.
and the Republican Party,
Right.
even if Fine wins.
Yeah.
If it's closer than expected,
Right.
Democrats are going to say that means support for Republicans is fading.
Right.
And Republicans are obviously going to want a big win.
Right. To prove everyone wrong.
Exactly. To show that they're still strong.
So it's interesting because both Forbes and the New York Times said that the special election in Florida's 1st district
Right.
to replace Matt Gaetz
Right.
is probably going to be an easy Republican win.
Right.
So that makes this race in the 6th district even more important.
Right. Because it's the one to watch.
Yeah, exactly.
So as we wrap up here today, what are the key takeaways for our listeners?
Wow. I think the big one is that even in districts that seem to always vote one way,
Right.
lots of different things can come together
Right.
and make the race really competitive.
Right.
The candidates themselves,
Yeah.
the national mood, how much money each side has,
Right.
and how good their message is.
Right.
All of that matters.
Yeah, and it's interesting how Weil is focusing on issues like the cost of living.
And Social Security,
Yeah.
because that shows what voters are really worried about.
Yeah, I think so.
Even in a district that voted for Trump,
Right.
people are worried about their wallets.
Right.
And they're worried about their retirement.
It makes you wonder if those local issues might be even more important than party loyalty right now.
Yeah, so even though this is just one House seat,
Mm-hmm.
it's getting a ton of attention.
Right.
And a lot of money is being spent
Mm-hmm.
because it's a really big deal for both parties.
It's a preview of what's to come in 2025.
Right. So I think the big question that we're left with is,
Yeah.
if this district that usually votes Republican is this close,
Mm-hmm.
what does that tell us about the power of local issues
Right.
and how much voters care about the person running
Right.
versus just voting for their party?
Yeah. Is this just happening here?
Right.
Or is this a sign of things to come?
Right. Could we see this happen in other districts
Exactly.
that are considered safe seats?
It's a really interesting question to think about.
It really is.
As we head into these next elections,
Absolutely.